However, on the way out of Race's headquarters, his infection symptoms flare up again, causing him to pass out halfway back to the tower. He awakens in the ferry harbor and is greeted by Brecken, who informs him that all Antizin's drops have ceased for the past 36 hours. Crane wishes to contact Jade, who has Zir's research, so Brecken informs him that Jade has gone to Sector 0 with the help of the Saviors and that, if he wishes to contact her, he will also need the Saviors' assistance. He meets with Senk, the Saviors' contact, who agrees to smuggle Crane to Sector 0 after learning that Crane is the one who chopped Race's hand off. In the sewers, he meets Hazen, who leads him up to a location where other survivors are waiting. Crane is allowed to go first, and he travels through the sewers to Sector 0, encountering a few infected along the way. However, as they near Sector 0, Hazen informs Crane that Race has planned an ambush for him and explains that he had no choice because Race has him by the balls. Crane narrowly escapes Race's men once more and enters Sector 0, which is revealed to be Heron's old town. Crane unsuccessfully attempts to contact Jade and then Troy, informing her that he has arrived at Sector 0, prompting her to direct him to their headquarters, the Embers Tower. On his way to their tower, he calls Dr. Camden to update him on the status of bringing Zir's research to him. Crane arrives at the tower and meets 3 new people, Michael, Savvy, and Troy, who calls Jade for Crane, but snatches the radio from Troy's grasp as soon as Jade's voice is heard. Crane warns her to avoid Dr. Camden's clinic because it is infested with zombies, but Jade dismisses his warning, telling him that when she hears Crane's voice, all she sees is her brother. Crane goes on to tell Jade that he was hired by the GRE to retrieve the file stolen by Race and that the ministry attempted to bomb the city before being stopped by Crane. Jade doesn't buy it and hangs up on him after calling him a bastard. After Troy informs Crane that Jade was last seen at the university, he goes there, only to discover that she has already vanished, as informed by Fidan, who gives him a picture of Amir from Jade, as well as the message "not again," referring to how Amir was killed saving Crane, and then Rahim was killed by Crane. As he is leaving the university, he receives a call from Troy instructing him to return to the Embers Tower. Doing so, she shows him intercepted footage of a news broadcast, indicating that the Ministry of Defense has decided to bomb the city of Heron, justifying the decision by claiming that they have evacuated the so-called last survivor of the quarantine, who claims that there were no survivors left in the quarantine zone. To avoid this, Troy explains to Crane their plan to demonstrate to the world that there are still survivors in the quarantine zone by detonating explosives in an apartment building north of Old Town, which zombies cannot do. Crane goes to the sewers that lead to the apartment building, where he meets Michael, who gives him the explosives he needs to place inside the building. However, after placing the explosives and triggering them once outside, the Ministry of Defense jets fire missiles at the apartments, making it appear as if they were the ones who caused the explosions and not the survivors, erasing any evidence of survivors remaining in the quarantine zone. His actions do not go unnoticed, as he receives a call from Jade instructing him to meet her at the red building near Emerald Canal. However, when he arrives, he discovers that Jade has been kidnapped and taken to the museum by Race. Crane goes to gather information about a secret entrance into the museum from the custodian, who informs him that there is a secret entrance into the museum, located beneath it, accessed through an underwater tunnel, in order to sneak in unnoticed. Despite the museum custodian's warning that this would require scuba gear, Crane decides to try it anyway and manages to hold his breath just long enough to reach the end of the tunnel. Once inside, he confronts Race, threatening to chop off the latter's remaining hand if Jade is not released. Race disregards the threat and orders his men to execute Crane. Crane manages to kill the majority of Race's men and makes it to the location where Jade is being held captive. Race enters the room and informs Crane and Jade that since Crane reactivated the antenna, he has been able to listen in on every single conversation they had on their radios, which is how he was able to find and capture Jade. He releases the infected into the room to kill them, but Crane and Jade turn the tables. Race reveals as they are about to leave that Jade was bitten a few hours ago and will turn into a zombie in a few minutes. Race then thrusts an anti-Zin injector into Crane's hand, forcing him to choose between saving himself and sacrificing his life for Jade. Crane doesn't waste time thinking about it and tells Jade to take it, though she refuses and asks him to take her out once she's turned into a zombie, before leaving to another room. Crane follows her and begins to have a dream as a result of the symptoms caused by being so close to becoming a zombie. His dream leads him to a Jade who disappears through a series of floating islands depicting memories of past events. His dream is cut short when Jade injects him with anti-Zin, sacrificing herself for Crane. Rais is dissatisfied that Crane's decision was made for him by someone else and orders his men to kill them both. Jade kills all of Rais's men in the room just before she transforms into a zombie and begins eating the head of the last thug she killed, prompting Rais to quote Jack London's novel White Fang, "Eat or be eaten. Kill or be killed." Crane is compelled to murder Jade by snapping her neck. Rais orders Tahir to kill Crane, who manages to knock him out after a few minutes of ferocious combat. Crane searches Jade's bag for Zir's research but is disappointed to find only tissue samples. He asks Tahir where the rest of Zir's research is, and he responds by telling him to go to hell. Crane then slits Tahir's throat, claiming he's not the type of loose end to leave untied. Crane leaves the museum and meets Troy atop the old blue tower, where she reveals their new, more efficient plan for proving to the world that there are still survivors in Heron, which is to climb to the top of Heron's highest antenna and connect the amplifier to it to broadcast a message to everyone. Crane takes Troy's amplifier and heads to the sewers that lead to the antenna area. After crossing a few tunnels and killing a lot of infected, Crane finally emerges from a dam and finds himself inside the antenna area, where he contacts Savvy, as instructed to inform him that he has arrived at the antenna area so that he can guide him through the plan's next steps. Crane is told by Savvy that he must first locate a keycard, which he discovers inside a container surrounded by demolishers. Crane is then instructed by Savvy to turn on the transformer inside the substation, which he does, prompting Savvy to instruct him to use the elevator to reach the antenna. Crane, however, is unable to do so because lightning strikes the cable, causing the elevator to collapse and break into pieces, forcing Crane to climb to the top of the antenna, much to his chagrin. After climbing to the top of the antenna, he carries out the Ember's plan and uses the amplifier to send a message to the world, informing them that there are still survivors in the quarantine zone, implying that if Colonel Tenure and his men bomb the city, they will be considered cold-blooded murderers. The message is sent in advance, as the jets are about to bomb the city. Crane is then contacted by the GRE, who asks him to return Zir's research in exchange for rescuing him from Heron. Crane refuses, seeing this as a cover-up for the fact that they weren't working on a cure, but rather on weaponizing the virus. Crane ziplines away from the antenna before re-entering the old town through a tunnel near where he lands. Crane decides it's finally time to meet up with Dr. Camden, who is stuck in the clinic, surrounded by zombies, now that he has both recovered Zir's samples and prevented the Ministry of Defense from bombing the city. Crane enters the clinic and follows his instructions to Camden's study room, where he eventually finds him. Crane hands him the tissue samples, which Camden places in a processing machine before showing him the photo of Amir. Camden recognizes him as Amir Qureshi, a former GRE operative, before informing Crane that his machine has determined that the samples are still viable. He also mentions missing the rest of Zir's research, to which Crane responds that, for the time being, he must contact the GRE to see where things stand. Crane goes to the top of the old town observation tower and contacts the GRE, only to be answered by Rais, who tells him that he is at the top of his tower, along with the rest of Zir's research, waiting for the GRE to extract him via helicopter. He tells him that if he is extracted from Heron by the GRE, he will be able to do a lot of damage, and he dares Crane to confront him if he believes he can. Crane returns to the slums and goes to Rais's headquarters, where Rais begins taunting him through speakers scattered throughout his headquarters. Crane is forced to flee for his life when the infected begin to pursue him. After a brief run through the construction site, Crane falls inside a pipe and lands on a heap of bodies in the sewers, where he encounters a screamer who begins screeching and attracting nearby volatiles, forcing him to flee for his life once more. After a few minutes of running, he manages to elude them by clinging to a ladder across a pit. He emerges from atop the ladder in the same arena where he was forced to fight just a few days before, with Rais shooting him with a bazooka from atop. Crane escapes the arena with the help of a fallen container and makes his way to an elevator, which takes him to about 1/3 of the way to the top of the building. Meanwhile, Rais performs music he describes as the music of suffering played by slaves. Crane discovers a few of Rais's men dead, as well as a dying Kareem, who instructs him in his dying breath to avoid going directly up the stairs, as they planted mines on the upper floors before Rais betrayed them. Crane takes his advice and jumps on a nearby crane, allowing him to reach a neighboring building to Rais's tower and climb to the top of it. As he nears the top of the crane inside this building, he begins to move toward the end of the crane that touches Rais's tower. Rais tries to stop him by shooting rockets at the crane, causing it to fall, but Crane is able to grab onto the ledges on the tower just before the crane falls. Crane is then able to reach the very top of the tower and confront Rais, who threatens to destroy Zier's research. Rais distracts Crane by tossing Zier's research into his hand before hurling a knife at his chest, forcing him to drop the research. Crane then begins a duel with Rais, who has a machete. Crane manages to turn Rais's weapon against him after a brief duel, shoving it right into his chest. Crane decides to abandon Rais, ensuring that he will spend the rest of his life in agony. Crane then goes to retrieve Zier's research, but is met by Rais, who runs into him, causing them both to fall on a container at least 100 meters above the ground. Crane manages to catch Zier's research just in time, despite having to grab onto one of the supports holding the container with only one hand. Rais instructs Crane to give him the research so that Heron has a chance of survival in exchange for making his death as painless as possible. Crane agrees and gives him Zier's research before Rais attempts to force Crane's hand off the support, which Crane prevents just in time by unsticking the knife from his chest and propelling it into Rais's throat, causing him to roll and fall to his death. Crane then climbs onto the container and leaps back onto the tower's solid ground. The GRE helicopter then asks him to bring back Dr. Zier's research, which Crane refuses to do for the same reasons as before, forcing them to leave. Crane is then contacted by Dr. Camden, who says that if Crane can return Dr. Zier's research, which Crane now has, a cure is likely. Recognizing this, Crane gets up and heads back to Dr. Camden to deliver the research.